ठीक है सर. We were discussing the relative rather merits of freedom or the concept of freedom in Islam vis-a-vis the Western understanding and we were also trying to understand the way this paradigm has been fixed in our minds, and we have rather generally been looking at freedom or the concept of freedom from that Western perspective. The other important thing is that this freedom, whatever we were talking about in the West, is something of very recent origin in terms of human history. Because this concept of freedom, whatever it is, and we discussed the different dimensions of it, is something which came only with the establishment of a state, the modern nation state, in the 17th century. The state in which we live nowadays, the architecture of the world, is the nation state which came into being after the Treaty of Westphalia in 1648. And it is this state basically which ensures or which is the guardian of the concept or the freedom or civil liberties which citizens have in the modern world. Now this freedom actually, or the concept of freedom which this modern state claims to promote, the state in which we live, it claims to promote this concept of freedom. But first we need to also look at the competence of this modern state to promote this freedom, the claim, to promote freedom. Because the modern state in today's world is known as the nation state. Nation state means a state which is also a nation. That means that a nation is a cultural and a historical concept. Means that a collection of people have been living together for a certain period of time. They develop certain commonalities, certain common cultural traits, certain psychological links, and those things will eventually make you a nation. And the idea was to make all these nations into political entities by the name of nation states. Now what happens in this nation state is that the dominant cultural group, becomes synonymous with the nation, and minority cultural groups are pushed to the background. So what happened in Europe when nation state idea came in the 17th century was that they forced the minorities to either assimilate, to become like them, or to get out. So the dominant idea of the nation was imposed on everyone. And the West did not have any idea of minority rights. Now can you imagine the West, which claims to have so much of freedoms and civil liberties, rather it claims to have given these things to its citizens, did not have any idea of how to protect these minorities, or did not even think of protecting minorities. The idea of minority rights is something which is of very recent origin. The group rights or group human rights are something which are just 100 years old, It's not a very old idea. And Islam was talking about minority rights long back, 1400 years back. Islam was talking of minority rights, that whatever is good for the minority is good for the majority. It is exactly opposite to the understanding here. What is being operationalized in our societies, the general understanding is that what is good for the majority is good for the minority. Today what is happening in our country, that you are being made to rather accept that whatever is the worldview or the assumed worldview of the majority has to be accepted by the minority. In fact, the minorities have no choice. Although there are a lot of constitutional safeguards, but operationally minority rights are a no starter in a country like India. But what does Islam say? It says that majority or the interest of the majority has to be tested on the touchstone of minority. So whatever is good for the minority has to be good for the majority. Means Islam is prioritizing the minority and prioritizing the rights of the minority. See the difference. Similar is the case about all sections of deprived groups in the society. That all such weaker groups have been prioritized in the Islamic concept of welfare state. That they are the first, they have the first claim on resources. Everywhere their claims are prioritized. Because the understanding is that people who are stronger, who are powerful, who are wealthier, they would be able to look after their rights on their own. The protective mechanism has to be given to the weaker sections. This is something which has evolved only in the 20th century, late 20th century in the world. America, which talks so much of minority rights, affirmative action, even in universities were finally accepted by the Supreme Court only by the year 2000. That there should be affirmative action, positive action to help the people who are on the margins of the society. So, even if you say that those things are present in the modern understanding of rights and civil liberties, they are things which have come very late in the discourse on rights and freedom in the world. And what we are doing is that we are usually taking that frame of the West and then evaluating Islam from that frame. Although Islam in terms of freedom and civil liberties was much rather ahead of the West in terms of conceptualizing these things. It is a different matter that some people would argue that go to countries which are Muslim, so-called Muslim countries, and you would not find any of those freedoms which Islam claims to have. Now there is a big difference between what is there in Islam and what Muslim countries are doing. Likewise, as there is a big difference between what is there in Islam and what is being practiced by somebody who claims to be a Muslim. So you cannot judge Islam from the conduct of Muslims. And same is true of any other faith. But the point is that these ideas, these concepts of freedom were there in Islam. That means that the idea of freedom, the idea of civil liberties in a society were so well developed in the conceptualization of, Islamic thought, Islamic thinking, that these things were already there. And the basic logic was that these things or these ideas or these freedoms rather were very nicely balanced by the concept of afterlife in Islam. Because what happens that in the Western framework, it is, as I mentioned in the very beginning, that as it is said that life, liberty and the pursuit of happiness means this is life. Means for an individual this life is the end. This is my life, I have to enjoy whatever gives me enjoyment and everything finishes with this life. And what gives me enjoyment are only material things in life. So all freedom is to be used for the attainment or possession of material things, for the self, with the basic assumption that these material things will give me happiness. That is the assumption. Now, if you come to Islam, the assumption is that what gives you happiness is not in taking but in giving. Are you getting my point? The difference is that you don't have to be possessive, but you have to seek happiness in giving. You have to get happiness by making others happy. And whatever sacrifices you make in this life, whatever good things you do in this life, you will get the reward in the life hereafter. So what happens that the emphasis is, or the ideal is, not to become a possessive animal who is constantly trying to possess more and more material things to get happiness. So the idea of freedom is totally materialistic in the Western framework. which is totally shorn of spirituality, where every happiness is related to worldly possessions. Now what is the consequence? If you look at the Western society today, in general, you find a lot of alienation in the Western society. And that alienation or that dissatisfaction, that frustration which drives people to drugs, which drives people to binge drinking, which drives people to psychiatric disorders, it is actually a direct consequence of the inability of these material goods to give you real happiness. And that creates a void in you, because you have all those things which claim to make you happy and still you are not happy. Thankfully, people in poor countries like us who also idealize those things have not yet reached to the point where you will get frustrated, because all our life we are thinking of possessing those things, but we are not able to possess them and we leave this world. So most of us actually still die in this part of the world. We die thinking that we still did not have those things which could have made us happy. So at least we have that hope and we die. But in those societies which are prosperous societies, post-materialist societies, where people have all those things which claim to give you happiness, and still the person is not happy. So what happens? You resort to these things, you get extremely frustrated, you get psychiatric problems, all kinds of things happen, That shows the limitations of those material things in providing you happiness. Because if they were to provide you happiness, then why this consequence is there? Why the highest percentage of population in a country is in prisons? That is in America, which is supposedly the most prosperous country in the world, which has its highest percentage of people in jails. Why is it happening like this? Why the highest percentage of kids, or youngsters in crime, in high crime? So high percentage of consumption of psychedelic drugs amongst youngsters. Such high suicide rates in countries like Japan, which are considered to be the most prosperous from that perspective. Why it is happening? That shows that the claims which are made by that system are not actually actualized in the real sense. But when you come here, the perspective is totally different. The idea is to search for truth within yourself, to understand yourself, to have knowledge about yourself, that what am I, what am I doing in this world? What is the purpose of my birth? The purpose of your birth in this world is not to have material possessions. The purpose of your birth in this world is to do something good for others. So therefore what happens, that you have a different worldview, a different perspective, a different mindset towards things. And therefore that acquisitive instinct which is promoted in a capitalist society is very beautifully rather restricted in this Islamic worldview, where you are not encouraged to go in this mad race of acquiring material things, because you are told that these material things have their limitations. They cannot provide you real happiness. Real happiness is something which is inside, which is something very spiritual, and that is only attained when you try to derive happiness by acting in a responsible manner. And what is that responsible behavior in the society? Responsible behavior is that when you think that you are not an individual here, but you are an inalienable part of this human society. So the family is not only in your house, but this is an extended family in which you are living. And you have your responsibilities towards the other people in this society. Now your responsibilities increase with the increasing resources you have. So the more resources you have in terms of wealth, in terms of power, in terms of other possessions, you have more responsibilities. If I have lesser resources, I have lesser responsibilities. So therefore, you are free to do whatever you want. But this responsibility, balances that freedom.
It does not let it become a license to do whatever you want, because you become a responsible citizen. So when as a responsible citizen I am exercising my freedom, for example my freedom of expression, I will use it considering what effect my freedom of expression will have on you. Contrast it with the Western idea of freedom of expression. You know all those stories, not stories, instances of offensive writings and all those cartoons of the Prophet which were there in the Danish newspapers and all kinds of things which the West glorifies that this is freedom. That is not freedom. Unrestricted freedom is license. So you are, in using your emotional freedom which I mentioned earlier, you are hurting the sensibilities of other people, you are hurting the emotions of other people, and it is not bringing any good to the society. If it were bringing something good, then it is fine, But what is the end result? Acrimony, bad blood among communities, and you are disturbing the social order. So when you are using your freedom of expression, as Islam gives you freedom of expression, anybody can say anything. People are free, but freedom does not here mean that you will exercise it in an emotional manner. You will exercise it as a license to say whatever you want. When you are using it, you have to use your sense of responsibility, yet knowledge. You understand, you need to understand how I have to use this freedom. What I have to say, what effect it is going to have on others, what effect it is going to have on the society, on the social order, on peace, on tranquility, on social order. Everything has to be taken into account. Imagine a situation if all of us were thinking like this, what will happen of the society? So nobody will eventually be offended by anybody else's sayings. What you are saying today, even in India or anywhere in the world, every day newspapers are full of people speaking without thinking, speaking whatever they think is right, without giving an iota of thought to what effect my speech and action will have on other human beings. Because you are totally self-centered, you are too obsessed with that idea of license which you have, and therefore you are exercising it, that is unrestricted, unbridled license to say and do whatever you want. That is not freedom, in the real sense. Freedom in Islam is something very substantive, very real, and that is rather couched in a very beautiful framework of sense of duty and sense of responsibility, whereby you understand how you are using your freedom. What is the extent of your freedom? Because as I have got my rights, as I have got my freedoms, you also have your rights and freedom. So I cannot use my freedom to restrict your freedom. I cannot use my right to abrogate your rights, because your rights are as sacrosanct as my rights. Now, if all of us are concerned about our rights or individual rights, there would be conflict in the society. But imagine an Islamic society where everybody is more concerned about other person's rights. So if all of us are concerned about the other person's rights, your rights are automatically ensured. Nobody is there to abrogate your rights, because we are all more concerned about others, because you are a fellow human being. We are all one family. We are all bound by the real concept of universal brotherhood of man. We are all one. So that is the reason why this concept of freedom is something which is very, very different. And if you are looking at it from the Western framework, probably we are not able to appreciate the beauty, the depth, and the nuance which lies in this understanding of freedom, which is the Islamic idea of freedom. So we need to shed our glasses, we need to shed our biases, we need to shed our frameworks, and if we shed those frameworks, we would be able to really understand the beauty of this idea of freedom in Islam, which is something very substantive, very real, very lasting, which can actually bring more prosperity, more peace, more oneness, more unity, and more harmony in the society. But that is something which will come to you only when you understand this concept in its holistic perspective. If you look at it from a very narrow perspective, if you look only at certain aspects of that freedom, you would not be able to really appreciate what it basically thinks of. So the Islamic perspective has a certain, it's a whole world view, it's a framework. And out of that framework, you cannot pick and choose. You have to take the whole framework. And if you take the whole framework, you will find that it is a very beautiful architecture in which everybody has very defined roles. Islam very beautifully defines your roles and then leaves you free to do whatever you want to do. Are you getting my point? Like we teach students all the year, 12 months or 6 months, whatever in a semester, we teach you everything, we tell you everything, and then in the examination, all you are free to do whatever you want. You know, if you write well, you will get good marks. If you don't write well, you will not get good marks, but you are free to write whatever. Nobody stops you. Here also your roles are defined, you are told what you are supposed to do, all your roles are very nicely and in great detail defined, and then you are free to do whatever you want, and at the end, everything has to be evaluated. You have to account for every action. No action ends with the end of your life here. In fact, your answer sheets are to be evaluated and the results will come in the life hereafter. So, it is something which has a lot of element of rather spirituality, in the sense that somebody who believes in the life hereafter, or who understands what is this belief in the life hereafter, can only understand the logic of this action. Otherwise, you would think that it is something, which you will not be able to understand if you don't believe in the life hereafter, because life ends here. So everything has to be accounted for in this world. But no, the Islamic perspective says that no, nothing ends here. Things will begin after this. So whatever you give here, you will get things in return. So that is a certain logic which one needs to appreciate, and if you are able to appreciate that, only then one is rather able to understand the logic of this concept, this idea. I think I will stop here to take, because there will be a lot of questions and comments, then we can rather focus on certain specific areas of this discourse. So we'll take up your questions now and then we'll take up the discussion further.
आपने एक जगह ट्रीटी का जिक्र किया था,
जी।
जिसमें नेशन स्टेट्स का आइडिया इनिशिएट हुआ था, उसका नाम बताइए।
Treaty of Westphalia. Westphalia, Westphalia, 1648. हाँ बोलो, बेटे बेटे.
Sir, there is a book on the Western progression of an Islamic world, Islam at the Crossroad, by Muhammad Asmer. So in that book, sir, I have been through, but I realized that these things are exactly what you have said in after the 21st century. Exactly, we practice the Western framework of Islamic world, but right now we are more influenced with Islamic perspective. So, sir, how we can come out of that things? सर कहना मतलब ये चाह रहा हूँ सर, किससे बाहर कैसे आएंगे? ये वो फ्रेमवर्क उनका है, वेस्टर्न फ्रेमवर्क है, कौन से हम मेथड्स अडॉप्ट करेंगे, कौन से इम्प्लीकेशंस हो या कौन से वैल्यू सिस्टम हो कि हम इससे बाहर आएं?
मतलब एज एन इंडिविजुअल या एज अ ग्रुप?
एज ए इंडिविजुअल, एज अ कलेक्टिव सर, वो कि उस सिस्टम से कैसे उस फ्रेमवर्क